Hello, welcome to nannyreilly.com, Tales Along the Trail. With your complimentary ebook, I'm going to take it up in chapter 1 where I left off. With that, Nanny and Henry Daly ran off home. Nanny's thoughts were on King Brian's warning. What would happen to her auburn curls if a mushroom grew out of her head? She never thought of her one wish. On Saturday morning, Nanny took Henry Daly to the village to mail a letter. The village store also acted as a post office and gas station. Henry stayed outside, lying in the sun. He liked to lay with his front paws crossed while he observed the activities of the villagers. Nanny went in to mail the letter. Just as Nanny was paying for the stamp, Ned Frainie and his mother walked in. Ned stood behind his mother, looked at Nanny and stuck out his fat tongue. Nanny frowned at him and looked away. "How are you today, Nanny?" asked Mrs. Donahue, the owner of the establishment. She was placing a tray of freshly made toffee apples on the counter. "I have a headache," replied Nanny. Nanny was very worried about the task she and Henry had ahead of them at midnight. "A headache?" Mrs. Donahue said. "What could possibly give a 9-year-old like yourself a headache?" Nanny looked at Ned's mother, wishing she could tell her the truth. Ned opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something mean to Nanny, but he couldn't, because his mother and Mrs. Donahue would hear him. Nanny sighed with relief. Though the secret was not only making her head hurt, it made her tummy flop all over too. Nanny knew she couldn't tell anyone about meeting King Brian at McGandy's pond. If Ned Frainie heard, he wouldn't believe her. He'd be laughing at her and chanting, "Liar, liar, your pants is on fire, your tongue is as long as a telephone wire." "I think it's the change of weather giving me the headache," Nanny answered as she handed the stamped envelope to Mrs. Donahue. "Would you like a toffee apple for your headache, Nanny?" asked Mrs. Donahue, her round face turning into a smile. "A toffee apple?" said Nanny. "Yes, please." Nanny quickly glanced over her right shoulder and saw Ned Frainie crinkle up his freckled nose. "Here you are, Nanny." Mrs. Donahue handed Nanny a homemade toffee apple. "I hope you're feeling better soon." "Thank you very much, Mrs. Donahue," replied Nanny. Her frown turned into a smile. It was a rare thing to get a free toffee apple from Mrs. Donahue. "I have to go now. My mother wants me to go straight home and no dilly-dallying." Nanny looked at Ned. She smiled and raised her nose in the air. She suddenly forgot all her woes and walked out of the store licking her toffee apple and leaving Ned Frainie frowning, his red freckled face blended with his fiery red hair. Nanny thought about sticking her tongue out at him, but she didn't. That night, Nanny went to bed in her jeans, sweater and sneakers, which felt lumpy and weird, but what could she do? Henry lay stretched out at the end of her bed. His long tail would occasionally wag and hit the bedpost as Nanny spoke softly to him. "What if we don't wake up in time?" Henry Daly wondered Nanny. "Will I wake up tomorrow morning with a mushroom grown from my head?" Nanny shuddered, thinking of the events that may occur on Sunday morning. "Jeepers! If I wear a scarf on my head, the mushroom will be sticking up underneath it. The whole village will see me at Mass. We'll have to pack our belongings and leave Kilrainy." Near midnight, everyone was in bed asleep except Nanny. She put a soccer ball and a pillow under the blankets. That way, if her mother looked in on her, she would think Nanny was there. Nanny and Henry were very careful not to make any noise as they crept out the back door. It was a full moon, so Nanny didn't need her dad's flashlight. Henry Daly struck out first, and the two made their way to McGandy's pond to meet King Brian. Nanny and Henry left the backyard through the gate and jumped over the ditch behind the house. They headed off down Katie's Lane. "You go first, Henry Daly," whispered Nanny. "Dogs can see in the dark." Henry trotted through the gate with his ears pricked and his tail straight up in the air. Nanny walked briskly down the moonlit lane and kept to the centre. She was afraid something might jump out at her from either side. About 1/4 down the lane, Nanny climbed over a wooden fence and Henry crawled underneath. An owl hooted from the tall elm tree down the lane. The hair stood up on the back of Nanny's neck and shivers ran down her spine. "Let's run, Henry Daly," she said. "We'll get there faster." The two ran across the moonlit field all the way to McGandy's pond. When they got there, King Brian was waiting on the same mushroom that glowed in the moonlight, holding a sack. Henry growled at King Brian and stood close to Nanny. King Brian was beaming from ear to ear when he saw Nanny. He scowled at Henry, and for a minute Nanny thought there was going to be a dog-leprechaun tussle. But Henry stood close to Nanny's legs, though he growled softly every few seconds. "There you go, lass," King Brian said. "Take this sack with this rabbit in it to the middle of Katie's field in Ballinesker. When you get there, you'll find a rabbit's burrow. Open this sack over the entrance of the burrow and let the rabbit run lickety-split into the burrow. Wait there for a minute with the sack still open over the burrow, and another rabbit will run into the sack. Close up the sack as quickly as you can and bring it back here to me." The king rubbed his hands and hunched his shoulders in delight. "You must be back here before dawn breaks," he warned. "If not, a mushroom will start appearing on your head." The king reached into his cloak and pulled out a small shillelagh. He waved it at Nanny as though it were a magic wand. "And whatever you do, don't look in the sack." The rabbit was making brave attempts to jump from the sack. Henry was moving his head sideways with his ears pricked forward, staring at the busy sack. He yelped several times. "This sack is not for chasing, Henry Daly," said Nanny. "We have to make sure this rabbit stays right where it is until we get to that burrow." Nanny felt the top of her head to make sure there was no sign of early mushroom sprouts. She threw the sack over her shoulder and took off across the field with Henry Daly at her side. I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening. Log on to nannyreilly.com, Tales Along the Trail, and find out what happens next.